The travel grants that students received, 16 students applied, and the committee decided that all 16 should be awarded the grant. So I'm going to call the name of each student who will receive a certificate and of course the check for $300. Student has to be a member of the Southwestern Social Science Association, present a paper, have financial need, and be at the conference to present the paper. So here are the 16 names. Please come forward. You will receive the certificate and the check from Dr. Hal Bass, who is our pass, I don't know how many past times 10 or something to that effect, president, who will be giving you the certificate and the check. Dr. Hal Bass, would you be able to come up? So the first person on the list is Madison Adams. Why don't you come by and get the photograph of your son?
There you go. Yeah.
Thank you. The next one is Joel Chavez. From this way.
Oh, yeah. Makes sense. Yeah.
Kiera Higgins.
Here's the check. I don't get this.
Is it in order?
I think it doesn't. I had a feeling.
Okay, the next one is Rachel Johnson. We now have Anne Kelly. Casey Grant.
Did I get the picture there? Make sure I didn't.
This is just one. Omar Mali. Amy McGowan. Jacqueline Mendes. Lisa Raza. Aina Shamiradova. Jordan Spencer. Sabina Kabirova. Nassim Garcia de Silva. Mehri Yavari. Thank you. Daisy Grant, do you have another name?
You got it.
Is that like, okay?
We're done.
And Sun Min Yoon. Congratulations to all for singing together. And students who are sitting here who didn't receive a travel grant, it's because you didn't apply. So when you see a grant or a scholarship, please apply. Don't allow the money to remain on the table. Thank you so much, Dr. Halvas. Okay, let's come to the serious matter of the day. Now that the grants were not serious, I would like to introduce our presidential plenary speaker today, Dr. Jennifer Marchia. Good job. I'm not at quite a number of names, I don't want to do one more. She's an award-winning professor in the Department of Communication and Journalism at Texas A&M University. She writes about American political discourse, especially as it relates to citizenship, democracy, and the presidency. She's published 3 books: Founding Fictions, The Rhetoric of Heroic Expectations, Establishing the Obama Presidency, and Demagogue for President, The Rhetorical Genius of Donald Trump. Her academic scholarship has been published in Quarterly Journal of Speech, Presidential Studies Quarterly, Rhetoric and Public Affairs, Argumentation and Advocacy, and Rhetoric Society Quarterly. And she's a member of several editorial boards. She's a contributing editor for Zocala, The Public Square, and writes a rhetorical tricks, defense against the dark arts. She has a very long bio, so I'm cutting some at random and moving on. She has written public scholarship about rhetoric and politics to The Conversation, USA Today, Washington Post, and other major media outlets. She's been interviewed about rhetoric and politics for the BBC World News, NPR's All Things Considered, NPR's 1A, Diane Wren, the New York Times, CNN, ABC News, The Guardian, and the list goes on. Her public scholarship articles have had more than 3 million views online and have been translated into foreign languages, republished in newspapers, and used for teaching current events to high school students nationwide. In 2022, Jennifer shared an expert statement for the record to the US House of Representatives Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol, about her research on Trump's violent rhetoric and how it contributed to the violence in the Capitol. Her 2020 book on Donald Trump's rhetoric, Demagogue for President, The Rhetorical Genius of Donald Trump, was reviewed in the Washington Post, and some of the comments. It deserves a place alongside George Orwell's Politics of the English Language and Harry G. Frankfurt's On Booze. Brilliant dissertation on Trump's patented brand of balderdash that makes it one of the most important political books we've read this summer. There are many reviews on it, and the American Association of American Publishers awarded this book a 2021 prize, Prose Award, for excellence in social sciences, government, and politics. It also won the Forward Indies winner, earning a bronze medal in the category of political and social sciences. She's a 2016 recipient of the Texas A&M Association of Former Students Distinguished Achievement Award in Teaching, the highest student award given to faculty for teaching at Texas A&M University. Let's now give a warm welcome, Southern welcome, to a Southern professor who will speak to us now.
I'll never get over being embarrassed when they introduce you. Howdy. That's what we say at Texas A&M when we're among friends. So I feel like I know you already, so I'm gonna howdy you. It's absolutely my honor to be invited to speak here today. When I heard the topic of your conference, I was like, I absolutely have to submit something. I've been working on democratic erosion, democratic backsliding, communication democracy for a really long time. So I was just thrilled that you were going to have this conversation, and then just absolutely honored when I was invited to speak. So just really humbled to be here. And really the joy in all of this has been getting to know Dr. Sally Vargas. She is just the most wonderful person, and I really enjoyed having the conversation. So thank you so much for inviting me, and I look forward to hearing your comments after. See how this goes. In 2018, I appeared on a panel at the Texas A&M Texas Tribune TribFest, a politics festival blending media personalities, elected officials, and academics. The panel was organized by senior political reporter Jonathan Tyler from the Austin Statesman and focused on my research on weaponized communication and the rhetoric of Donald Trump and Alex Jones. As I listened to my co-panelist, then BuzzFeed columnist Charlie Warzel, describe what infamous conspiracy theorist Jones had done to be deplatformed, to have his social media accounts banned from YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, I looked out at our audience and I was somewhat surprised to see that Alex Jones himself was now seated directly in front of me, legs splayed, bullhorn in hand, a grimace on his face. Jones blamed Warzel for getting him deplatformed. He was there to settle a score and also to create political theater. He would post that political theater on his website, InfoWars, inviting his approximately 9 million monthly users to see me and my co-panelists as brainwashed liberals and leftist zombies who were conspiring to shut down political speech. The videos he posted bore little resemblance to reality. Jones distorted the sound, our faces, the scene, in order to frame himself as the victim of irrational aggressors, as well as a free speech hero. As Jones bullhorned our panel, calling Charlie Weasel Warzel and accusing us all of being authoritarian bootlickers of the establishment, modern-day book burners, and the kind of people who put Stalin in power, he also carefully directed his two cameramen to stand in the correct positions for the best shots, and cued his two accomplices, a woman and a man who he had prearranged to attack him, into and out of the scene. I was frightened of Jones at first, but after making eye contact with him, I realized that he wasn't there to hurt me physically. He was there to rant and rave for the cameras, to cause a dramatic scene for his show. The danger from Jones wasn't immediate. The danger was in whatever happened once Jones posted the video as outrage bait on his website, setting his info warriors into motion to dox, swarm, and harass us. As he continued to bullhorn us, until at long last, the Austin Police Department escorted him out. After he left, I used the few remaining minutes in our panel to explain how Jones attacking us was exactly what I meant by weaponized communication, using communication as a kind of force, and why that kind of communication threatens democracy. It's pretty easy to recognize bullhorning as a kind of force. The bullhorner uses the force of amplified sound to speak over, dominate, intimidate, and silence others. But other forms of weaponized communication are harder to see for what they are. Weaponized communication is bullhorning and intimidation and swarming and doxing, but it's also spreading misinformation, outrage, cynicism, conspiracy, and hypocrisy. And Jones isn't the only one who uses it. We're living in an era of widespread weaponized communication. It seems a lot of us have forgotten how to communicate democratically. It makes a lot of sense to use weaponized communication if you think of our public sphere as an arena for the information wars, but that's not what it's supposed to be. Our political system is based on a concept of the public sphere as a place for democratic deliberation, or a place for citizens to discuss and debate issues that affect the public, eventually coming to some kind of agreement or consensus. This is why the First Amendment protects our communication rights as citizens. Our right to a free press and to petition, assemble, and speak freely are necessary for a properly functioning public sphere and government. Of course, our public sphere has never functioned perfectly, but weaponized communication is the opposite of democratic deliberation. In fact, it's neither democratic nor deliberation. In my talk today, I'll first describe why using communication as a weapon is treason to the democratic way of life, and how two propaganda models, each with different strategies and effects, emerge to control our public sphere. Next, I show how our public sphere is dominated by the widespread use of information warfare techniques that normalize the fascist idea that politics is war and the enemy cheats. Over the past decade, we've seen political leaders use anti-democratic communication strategies like conspiracy theory, reification, and stochastic terrorism to control the political conversation and position others as heat objects to be attacked and destroyed. Through this discussion, we'll see that communication that's good for democracy is scarce. Using communication as a weapon is a winning strategy judged by the metrics of attention and engagement, but it's a losing strategy for democracy. Our prospects look pretty grim, I'm afraid, but I'll conclude by explaining why I think there is reason to hope. In 1939, just 9 months after 20,000 people attended a Nazi rally at Madison Square Garden in New York City, philosopher John Dewey, 80 years old and too frail to deliver the speech himself, gave a stark warning from that same stage. The task before Americans was clear, Dewey believed. They had to choose between autocracy and democracy. If they wanted democracy to survive, Dewey warned, Americans had to start thinking of it more than just a political system. Americans could only defeat Nazism if they recognized that democracy is also a way of life, a specific way of associating, thinking, and communicating. Today, the threat is not Nazism specifically. It is autocracy in all of its many forms. Dewey's warning about the health of our democracy still applies. The level of democracy enjoyed by the average global citizen in 2022 is down to 1986 levels, according to the 2023 VDEM report. The world has more closed autocracies than liberal democracies for the first time in more than 2 decades. Only 13% of the world's population lives in a liberal democracy. Around the world, freedom of expression is deteriorating, with autocratic governments censoring media and threatening academic freedom and cultural expression. Freedom House reports that around the world, political rights and civil liberties have deteriorated for the past 17 years, though perhaps the threat of democratic erosion is starting to level off. According to the Democracy Index, the United States has a flawed democracy, a downgrade from our full democracy ranking that occurred in 2017, a trend that continued throughout the Trump presidency. According to a November 2022 YouGov survey, 62% of Americans believe that democracy in America is under threat. How did we get here? The first thing to realize is that we're vulnerable to democratic backsliding. As Robert Putnam explained in Bowling Alone, over the past several decades, a lot of us have stopped associating, thinking, and communicating democratically. As we've withdrawn from public life, we've lost bridging social capital and trust in the political process. This is a problem because, as political theorists have warned us, trust is a social lubricant. Distrust is a democracy killer. A 2022 AP NORC poll showed that just 9% of US adults think democracy is working extremely or very well, while 52% say it's not working well at all. We've heard calls for civil war, we've heard hate speech, domestic terrorism, and political violence are all on the rise. Like 1939, autocracy is a threat in America and around the world. In fact, just like 1939, it's later than you think. Democracy would beat Nazism in America, Dewey argued, so long as there were free gatherings of neighbors on the street corner to discuss back and forth what is read in the uncensored news of the day, and in gatherings of friends in the living rooms of houses and apartments to converse freely with one another. Dewey knew that democracy was threatened by intolerance, abuse, or the calling of names because of differences of opinion. He explained that everything which bars freedom and fullness of communication sets up barriers that divide human beings into sets and cliques, into antagonistic sects and factions, which undermines democracy. Dewey called all of those democracy-threatening communication practices treason to the democratic way of life. Treason is a strong word, but I think it's warranted here. A Democrat is someone who is motivated by freedom, equality, social justice, and political practices that allow all citizens to share power. As Dewey warned, there are certain ways of associating, thinking, and communicating that amount to treason because they increase distrust, polarization, and frustration between citizens, as well as between citizens and their government. In so doing, those treasonous communication practices threaten the fragile trust upon which democracy rests, which erodes democracy itself. Democracy is a way of life. Those who seek unlimited power for themselves, their party, their religion, or their race at the expense of others commit treason against democracy. Propagandists have been committing treason against the democratic way of life for a long time. Dewey wrote his warning in an era awash in propaganda, sometimes called the age of catastrophe. Mass propaganda techniques first emerged in the early 20th century during World War I. Leaders in Britain, France, Germany, and the United States harnessed the power of new and powerful communication technologies like photography, film, and radio to turn pacifist citizens bellicose. Advocates for propaganda in the United States, like Walter Lippmann, Edward Bernays, and Walter Creel, argued that propaganda was necessary to manage public opinion. These propagandists for propaganda explained with self-aware irony that democracy could only be saved by duping the public into believing what political leaders wanted them to believe. They knew that propaganda was anti-democratic, but argued that it allowed political leaders to control the public and their dangerous opinions. And so the ends justified the means. Propaganda, they said, was in the nation's best interest. Lippmann, for example, advised in his 1922 book, Public Opinion, that the manipulation of masses was an important tool for political leaders because it was difficult to get the public to act, and it was more important for the public to act than to understand. Lippmann recommended that the public would be led easily by strategically withholding and shaping information, using potent symbols, emotional appeals, and constantly exposing the public to suggestion through the press. The public reads not the news, explained Lippmann, but the news with an aura of suggestion about it, indicating the line of action to be taken. In these ways, propaganda could be used for gaining public acceptance without real consent. Though sometimes he called it the manufacture of consent, what he meant by consent was tacit consent at best, achieved through propaganda, not persuasion. It was manipulation. Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky famously critiqued Lippmann's version of consent, especially the way that mass media facilitated corporate, government, and military propaganda in their 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent. Chomsky later explained that Lippmann's propaganda for propaganda seemed prima facie to be common sense, even prudent, but it was always anti-democratic. Lippmann's propaganda seemed to contain a compelling moral principle behind it, namely that the mass of the public are just too stupid to be able to understand things. If they try to participate in managing their own affairs, they're just going to cause trouble. Therefore, they would be immoral and improper to permit them to do this. We have to tame the bewildered herd, not allow the bewildered herd to rage and trample and destroy things. Because the people are dumb cows or sheep or similar, elite leaders prudently had learned to tame them for their own good. One effect of the manufacture of consent propaganda model was that it kept Americans atomized and segregated and alone. According to Chomsky, if the bewildered herd organized, then it would threaten elite leadership. Lippmann's form of democracy worked best when the public was docile. Rendering citizens passive spectators created what political communication expert Elizabeth Noel Newman called the spiral of silence, the process by which people learn to silence what they perceive to be their own uncommon or unpopular opinions. In the 1990s and the early 2000s, political communication scholars worried about civic disengagement, about how low voter turnout, apathy, and cynicism had created a crisis in democracy. If Chomsky is right, then civic disengagement was the desired effect of the manufacture of consent. It was the explicit goal of Lippmann's propaganda model. That model of propaganda believed that when the public was engaged, it would just rage and trample and destroy things, which was the real crisis of democracy. One way to understand political disengagement, then, is that it is a logical result of a government based on the will of the people, in which propaganda was used to make sure that the people had very little power over the government. And so a lot of us tuned out of both public life and political news and information. It's only gotten easier to tune out as changes to media have made it very easy to avoid politics altogether. The manufacture of consent model was very effective at keeping us docile and politically disengaged. But eventually, new communication technologies emerged that allowed, even encouraged, our participation. The old propaganda model could not survive the diffusion of participatory communication technologies like talk radio, internet message boards, blogs, chats, text, social media, video, and internet-connected personal telephones. Some of us are now more politically engaged, and we're voting in record numbers, but our public sphere is just as dysfunctional, albeit in different ways. No longer tamed, the new propaganda, what I call the manufacture of dissent model, uses participatory media to set us in motion, to rage and trample and destroy things. This new propaganda is still anti-democratic. It uses us and our connections to audiences as a tool and turns us into propagandists too. In 1965, philosopher Jacques Ellul described the old propaganda as a kind of force working against our minds. We typically think of propaganda as what autocratic governments do to control their citizens, what Ellul called political and vertical, or top-down propaganda. But Ellul also explained that propaganda sometimes occurred horizontally, between people. Propaganda was perhaps most effective, he wrote, when it feeds on itself, and each person seized by it becomes in turn a propagandist. Obviously, our communication environment has changed dramatically since 1965. Back then, Ellul thought that horizontal propaganda would be limited because communication itself was limited to face-to-face interactions between people. But with 93% of Americans connected to the internet and 82% of us active on social media, we have the opportunity to become propagandists like never before. Unfortunately, many of us have seized that opportunity. The manufacture of dissent model of propaganda succeeds within the new logics of participatory media. Michael Goldhaber explained in 1997 that the information age had made information so accessible and ubiquitous that it had little value. What was valuable within the information age was what was scarce, he argued, our ability to give attention to information. As a scarce and finite resource, the attention economy was a zero-sum game. What one person gets, someone else is denied. Getting attention is rewarding because along with it comes the powers of agenda setting, priming, and framing. If you get attention, he wrote, that means you have some control over both the thoughts and actions of those paying it to you. Goldhaber predicted that people and institutions would go to great lengths to attract attention within the attention economy. Because as many a disobedient child knows, negative attention can be better than none at all. In the zero-sum game of the attention economy, weaponized communication strategies like bullhorning make good sense. Such tactics silence others and force our attention, which is why they proliferated. The mandates of the new attention economy shaped political communication and created a new kind of propaganda, one that used polarizing emotions like outrage to juice engagement. According to Jeffrey Berry and Sarah Soberai in their book, Outrage Industry, the growth of outrage media is a practical and savvy response to political, technological, and economic shifts that have transformed the media landscape since the 1980s. Prior to the dominance of the attention economy, media programmers sought to offend the fewest number of people in order to keep an audience. But now programmers produce content aimed at smaller, more homogeneous audiences. This niche programming allows cable television programs, radio shows, and blogs to deliver niche audiences to advertisers, specifically through the use of objectionable programming, which is dramatic, entertaining, and shocking enough to break through the clutter in a crowded field of cable options. They report that outrage entertainment is incredibly popular, with an audience of up to 47 million people daily. Not only is there an audience for outrage, but the audience is exactly the kind of politically engaged audience that political candidates seek to reach. After all, according to Ezra Klein, in an age of choices, political journalism is a business that serves people interested in political news and that tries to create more people interested in political news. Those of us who do consume political news are engaged and enraged on purpose. Ultimately, whether we're talking about the old propaganda or the new propaganda, both are a form of fascism. Propaganda's very nature is undemocratic because it influences us without our consent. But it is also one of the means used to achieve fascist ends. As philosopher Jason Stanley explained in his books, How Propaganda Works and How Fascism Works, propaganda is the communication strategy of fascists. The role of political propaganda, Stanley explained, is to conceal politicians or political movements' clearly problematic goals by masking them with ideals that are widely accepted. Or as philosophers Max Horkheimer and Theodore Adorno wrote in their 1944 book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, propaganda manipulates people. When it cries freedom, it contradicts itself. Deceit and propaganda are inseparable. A community in which the leader and his followers come to terms through propaganda, whatever the merits of its content, is a community of lies. Umberto Eco explained what he called the features of fascism, eternal fascism, in a 1995 New York Review of Books essay. According to Eco, fascists reject modernity, rationality, and critical thinking. Fascism appeals to our fears of difference and humiliation, and it portrays life as eternal warfare between us and them. Fascists have but one goal: to control nations. Some, like Hitler or Mussolini, gain that control through violence. But for most, violence isn't necessary. The easiest way for fascists to rise to power is by controlling political language. Sometimes fascists might go to extreme lengths to control language, like the Newspeak in George Orwell's 1984, that sought to limit and purify language in order to control thoughts. But most of the time, Newspeak isn't necessary either. Fascists can easily control our thoughts and behavior just by using rhetorical tricks and propaganda. Fascists use language to undermine democracy and control our political discourse. Their strategies cause the public to fear for their own safety and the nation's safety. The fascist then promises to use force to save the nation. For example, in the 1920s and 30s, Mussolini created a panic about the threats of communism and socialism in Italy, inventing fascism and promising to crush the nation's enemies once in power. It's a savvy strategy. After all, people are more likely to give their power to a strong leader if they're afraid, and they're less likely to resist fascism if they think they've actually chosen it. Mussolini didn't have any philosophy, explained Eco. He only had rhetoric. As Mussolini found, there are countless ways to control public discourse. Fascists can control access to the means of communication, to the channels, apps, algorithms, as well as use rhetorical tricks like conspiracy theory or outrage baiting. Not only do fascists use scary fear appeals, but they use communication itself as a weapon. Their information warfare strategies are designed to frame, normalize, and move the Overton window towards fascist thought, actions, and policies. Fascism thrives by appealing to a cult of tradition, by rejecting modernity, and by creating a political community where nationalism is prized, xenophobia is encouraged, and dissent is treason. Fascists accomplish their goals by telling the nation a simple story. Life is permanent warfare, they say, and we have been humiliated by our enemies who cheat. Fascists use those strategies to appeal to a frustrated nation while cultivating contempt for the weakest and defenseless, promising to purge the nation of outsiders, weirdos, and others framed as hate objects and less than human. Fascism is thought of as an aesthetic, as having a unique performative artistic quality. The old propaganda allowed leaders and governments to socialize the public into its fascist schemes. The new propaganda allows anyone to create and circulate messages using the fascist aesthetic. What's even more interesting, perhaps, is that the fascist aesthetic is embedded in the fundamental logics of the new propaganda. For example, these three memes were circulated by political leaders on their social media feeds. India's Narendra Modi, the United States, Donald Trump, and Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu. These memes are both fascist and built on the logics of the new propaganda. The Trump version, which has become central to his current presidential campaign, is the best performance of the fascist aesthetic of the three. The message is presented in black and white. Things are stark, but clear. There is no complexity. Trump looks at you, the viewer, in the eye. He's a straight talker. His eyebrows signal intensity. His gaze is strong, confident. He's addressing you with his gaze and with his hands. His hands forms a gun. He's a straight shooter. The text reads, in reality, they're not after me, they're after you. I'm just in the way. The apparent is not the actual, but Trump sees the plot clearly. He can explain the complicated with simplicity. Note the they versus you. They, what Rush Limbaugh called the four corners of deceit, government, academia, science, and the media, means anyone who is against the conservative agenda is a corrupt enemy. Anyone who is against Trump is also against you. Which side are you on? Trump is on your side, so you should be on his. Trump is your only protection, your only hope. He's your hero, but he's also a victim. He is sacrificing for you. Because he sacrifices for you, you owe him. You owe him your support, your vote, your devotion. In return, you will deify Trump. You will treat him like a god. You and he are victims of the same conspiracy, but together you're strong. Together you will maintain law and order. Trump's violence is justified. His violence is pure. Trump's fascist aesthetic is perfectly matched for the moment, perfectly matched for the new propaganda's mandates of attention and engagement. The fascist aesthetic presents the world as black and white, simple, but that simplicity is a lie. The lie benefits the fascist. The new propaganda's fascist aesthetic works to make us all propagandists. You are scared, but the message tells you not to waver. It promises you safety if you show your devotion to the fascist. The good life you've been promised won't be taken away if you send in a political donation. You can show your devotion by sharing the fascist message. You do, spreading their propaganda for them, for you. The manufacture of consent and the manufacture of dissent models of propaganda work together to prevent us from thinking, associating, and communicating democratically. Most of us are rendered docile tune-outs by the manufacture of consent. We don't pay attention to political news, and we aren't highly engaged in politics. According to a 2021 Gallup Light Foundation survey, something like 67% of Americans report that they don't read or watch the news regularly, don't pay for news subscriptions, and don't talk to others or post online about politics. They've tuned it out. They might get political news in ambient ways. They might vote, but they're not what scholars like Yana Krupnikov and John Barry Ryan call politically involved. In what they call the other divide, they found that between 80 to 85% of Americans are effectively tuned out. But some of us, just 15 to 20%, and maybe all of us in this room, are highly engaged with political news. We are what historian Claire Baum Potter calls political junkies, and we're responsible for breaking our democracy too. We aren't just paying subscribers who read the morning headlines or watch the evening news, but we read and watch political news all day long. We talk to people about politics and post about it online. We feel anxious when we could miss a politics story. And we engage with others who post political news and information, especially those who we believe have wrong opinions on the internet. Highly politically engaged people consume highly polarized political news. Politics is, according to Ezra Klein, first and foremost driven by the people who pay the most attention and wield the most power. And those people opt into extraordinarily politicized media. They then create the political system they perceive. That highly politicized media isn't even designed for persuasion, according to Klein. The bulk of opinionated political media is written for the side that already agrees with the author. And most partisan elected officials are tweeting to their supporters who follow them and fundraise for them, rather than their critics who don't. That's certainly not good for democracy. The manufacture of dissent model works on the highly politically engaged, a lot like George Orwell's 2 Minutes of Hate, enlisting us as propagandists too. The horrible thing about the 2 Minutes of Hate, wrote Orwell, was not that one was obliged to act a part, but on the contrary, that it was impossible to avoid joining in. Within 30 seconds, any pretense was always unnecessary. A hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness, a desire to kill, to torture, to smash faces in with a sledgehammer, seemed to flow through the whole group of people like an electric current, turning one, even against one's own will, into a grimacing, screaming lunatic. The manufacture of dissent has turned a lot of us, the most politically engaged and the loudest among us, into grimacing, screaming lunatics. You know your democracy is broken when politics isn't about solving problems, but is about creating a string of hate objects to keep your base engaged and enraged. What kind of democracy wants to turn its citizens into grimacing, screaming lunatics? Certainly not one that is functioning properly. Not only do we consume political news that is intentionally polarized and isn't trying to persuade or talk to anyone other than the highly partisan and highly politically engaged, a large part of the success of the new propaganda is in training us to confuse a deliberative communication occasion, a time and place where people deliberate to decide a political question, with a non-deliberative occasion. Actual deliberative occasions are maddeningly infrequent. PTA and school board meetings, public meetings with local, state, and federal elected leaders, political convention debates over platforms, places where decision makers ask for the public to comment on current issues and decisions facing that deliberative body. As we've withdrawn from public life, we've also been tricked into believing that all of our public communication is deliberative. We are asked to live and breathe our political commitments, performing them via our social media platforms and other connections. But social media platforms are not deliberative spaces, nor were they designed to be deliberative spaces. There is no decision being made. There is no decision maker to listen to us and consider our opinions. Sending our political opinions out into the world in non-deliberative contexts pollutes our public sphere with propaganda. But we're told that's democracy. For example, if you give your email address to any politics or politics adjacent organization, your inbox will be flooded with nonstop appeals, all including calls to action. Click here to write or call your representative and use our pre-written script. Click here to donate and save your freedom. And click here to post this message on all of your social media feeds. Do you do those things? Do you click? If you do you think about who your target audience might be and whether or not they can be persuaded by what and how you've communicated? Do you think about whether or not it's ethical for you to communicate in that way on behalf of this cause? Do you think about the ethics of flooding the zone with messages to control the conversation? If you do click, it's probably because the organization's call to action has you outraged or frustrated or scared. You probably aren't thinking about whether the message they want you to share is effective or if it's ethical for you to circulate and amplify it. The truth is, it's unlikely that you'll persuade anyone by sharing the messages, but you will get to perform your political identity, release a little bit of outrage, and help to saturate the public sphere with zombie political messages. Now they've got you playing the propaganda game, flooding the zone and participating in the information wars. Today we have what scholars like Kate Starbird sometimes call participatory disinformation that makes disinformation and other forms of propaganda an effective online collaborative work. By the 2016 election, retirees like 68-year-old conservative Daniel John Sobieski had taught himself how to make Twitter bot armies to spread his political messages. Sobieski took advantage of technology, allowing Twitter to users to post automatically from queues of pre-written tweets that can be delivered at a near constant round-the-clock pace that no human alone could match. His tweets reached the feeds of millions of others, making his one of the most powerful accounts during the 2016 election. Sobieski often used the PJNet hashtag to connect his tweets to the Patriot Journalist Network, a conservative organization that coordinates Twitter messages via chat rooms, dedicated apps, and daily hashtag rallies. Twitter has attempted to block these kinds of coordinated campaigns and bots, occasionally erroneously banning real-time megatweeters like 70-year-old conservative Nina Tomieski, who spends up to 14 hours a day tweeting whatever she sees on Fox News. Tomieski and her friends coordinated via Twitter rooms, which operate using the group messaging function to amplify their voices. She told the Associated Press in 2018 that she participated in about 10 rooms with 50 members each. She tried not to tweet more than 100 times an hour to avoid being blocked by Twitter. Likewise, high-profile progressive celebrities and activists like Deborah Messing and Don Cheadle use Twitter rooms to communicate and work in tandem to spread messages online. Calling themselves the Decency Collective, celebrities and activists use the rooms to coordinate and amplify one another's messages in order to fight the coordinated messages of the Twitter patriots on the right. All of this is evidence that Jacques Ellul was correct, and horizontal propaganda could become a powerful force, especially for the way that it feeds on itself, and each person seized by it becomes in turn a propagandist. As you see, the new propaganda is well engineered to turn us into propagandists. Attention and engagement are terrible metrics to use to organize our public sphere because they create a competition for attention, which allows the warlike communication strategies of propaganda to proliferate, enlisting us all in the information wars. Our public sphere is broken because we are either tuned out or we're screaming lunatics, consuming news and creating content saturated with partisanship and polarization, fear appeals, appeals to hypocrisy, outrage bait, and conspiracy. If you're online, then you're a node in the information wars. The highly politically engaged among us regularly post political content on behalf of a political candidate, party, or ideology. But do we have training in effective and ethical political communication? Not usually, but we should. If we had training in communication for democracy, we would know the difference between persuasion and propaganda, and between flooding the zone with zombie political messages and democratic deliberation. Politics is not war, and political communication does not have to be warfare. In fact, persuasion and propaganda are opposite ends of a continuum of verbal and nonverbal influence strategies. Persuasion is a dialogic meeting of the minds, in which one person asks another person to think like they do, to value the same values, to remember or forget history in the same way. It doesn't force. It affirms human dignity by inviting. A person who seeks to persuade gives good reasons and formulates arguments in the best way they know how, always affirming that the recipient of the persuasive message has a mind, values, and experiences of their own and may not change their mind. Persuasion is communication for democracy, and like democracy, it is difficult and time-consuming. Propaganda is a much easier, much faster, and much simpler strategy for changing minds, but it's not democratic. Propaganda treats people as tools to be manipulated. It denies human dignity or eminent value, the value that each of us have just because we are people, because it denies them free will and the ability to consent actively to what they are manipulated to believe. Propaganda exploits vulnerabilities in access to information by inventing, suppressing, or selectively releasing facts. It exploits vulnerabilities in social platforms by gaining engagement in algorithms. It exploits vulnerabilities in the attention economy by circulating outrage. And it exploits vulnerabilities in human beings by preying on our innate cognitive, emotional, and social weaknesses. Propaganda is communication for warfare, designed to exploit vulnerabilities. Like InfoWars says, there's a war on for the mind, and it's broken the public sphere. We are all vulnerable to propaganda, whether we're tuned out or screaming lunatics. So how do we fix our broken public sphere? Like Dewey said, we have to think democratically, associate democratically, and communicate democratically. We have to do democracy like Aristotle's golden mean, a mean between excess and deficiency, neither too much nor too little. What is the golden mean between a tune-out and a screaming lunatic? A citizen. Citizens use communication for democracy, not warfare. Let's do some democracy. And yes, democracy is something we do. In the last year, 2 different courts have found Alex Jones guilty of using communication like a weapon, fining him $1 billion for his irresponsible communication. Like Jones, we are all responsible for how we communicate. And we show what kind of communicator we are with everything we say or don't say, every like we tweet, video, or comment we make. Jones shows no signs of quitting the information wars, but the rest of us sure can. I don't typically think of myself as someone who has a strong desire to uphold norms for the status quo. Like many of you, perhaps, I've spent my career arguing that what we call democracy in America is a legitimate, a sleight of hand, that hides anti-democratic sentiment and institutional practices. I've believed that our hegemonic public sphere amplified the voices of those in power as it suppressed the voices of those who needed to be heard. I thought, and it seems naive now, that when the subaltern counterpublic spoke, it would bring more equality and justice for all. It turns out that the subaltern counterpublic that has spoken since 2016 was filled with neo-Nazis, conspiracists, fascists, and others who would use weaponized communication to violate democratic norms. I'm still not sure what to make of that, to be honest. All is not hopeless, however. The rise in weaponized communication is a rupture. Ruptures create liminal spaces, which can be used to create more democratic practices or more fascist ones. And of course, things aren't as bleak as they seem. Part of the propaganda for propaganda strategy is to demoralize us, to make us think that propaganda is all there is and all there can be, that everything is on the line and political communication is war and we'd better engage in battle. None of that is true. And recognizing that might ultimately help the cause of democracy. That's my hope anyway. We can learn the rules of productive conversations. We can learn to communicate as citizens and have productive democratic deliberation in the public sphere. We have more in common than they want us to believe. And frankly, fascism is for losers. Information warfare is for losers. If they had good arguments and they could persuade Americans to accept their policies, then they would. They don't, and they can't. Their fascist policies are very unpopular. So instead of persuading, they try to control the political conversation by forcing the public to comply. But democracy is stronger than fascism. Democracy is so strong that Democrats let people make arguments against democracy. Fascists don't do that because fascism is weak. Democracy will. Perhaps the right metaphor to leave you with is the Japanese practice of kintsugi, also known as golden repair. When a treasured vase or bowl is broken, it is mended with gold, which not only makes it whole again, it makes it even more valuable than it was before it broke. Our public sphere is currently broken, but as I said earlier, it never really worked that great to begin with. As we learn to think, associate, and communicate for democracy, we have the potential to make our democracy work better than it ever has before. Our task is the golden repair of our public sphere, our democracy, and our nation. E pluribus unum, out of many, one. Thank you.
I have a question first. You might get to know about 15 minutes into your speech, you wrote that a Manhattan grand jury has decided that the first president is charged.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
My question is about an incident that occurred last week, where an accident reporter out of Florida, Ben Montgomery was fired.
Yeah.
For having simply labeled a DeSantis press release as propaganda.
Yeah.
And then he was both further attacked and simultaneously defended by different sides because of the feeling that all communication that comes from elected officials is propaganda.
Right.
I would assume that you would reject that based on your conclusions.
Yeah, it's an interesting case. Thanks for bringing that up. So I don't know Ben. He's not one of the reporters that I've ever chatted with, but I know his best friend who DM'd me right away about this actually. And did you read the press release that he responded to the thing? Yeah. So it was, I mean, it's public relations, right? So trying to put a positive spin on something that happened so that it will be quoted. It's just the way the news works, right? You basically reprint press releases a lot. And so, yeah, they sent the press release and he wrote back and he said, I mean, that was all he said. He didn't even say more than that. He just said, this is propaganda. It's not news, right? It has no news value, right? Journalists have specific, as you probably all teach, right? They have certain news values. So yeah, that's very interesting. Would I have called that? I would call that public relations. I would call what they did, getting him fired, propaganda, right? I would call that information warfare. And I think the difference is that they were trying to suppress his ability to speak freely, right? They were trying to punish him for speaking freely. And they put out, so the press agent or whatever tweeted the email that he sent to put him out there to be attacked, just like Alex Jones did to me, right? And it worked. He got fired. So yeah, so I would say probably not, if I had to analyze that case, probably not the press release itself, but what happened subsequent to that, and the entire threatening environment that DeSantis has made for journalists in Florida. Because probably, as you know, and I see people nodding, he makes people register, he hides from journalists and doesn't let them in, only lets in friendly people. So I think that environment itself is part of fascist regime.
Any other question? Go ahead.
When you were studying historical fascism, and any patterns that you saw that we could replicate now, digital solution, other solutions to come back and seemingly open that spiral up with
Democracy stronger, fascism is for losers. I have stickers, by the way. I mean stickers. Yeah, I have them to give out. Come see me in their session. I have the democracy dog sticker and I have the fascism is for losers. I really do. Yeah, so. Political science literature would tell us that the way that you prevent the demagogue from attaining power is through the party system, right? That the party leaders would prevent and ostracize anyone who did not understand the limits of power. What we have seen is that that doesn't work. Because the new media environment, right, allows the demagogue or the fascist or whatever to go over the heads of the party leaders, and to put pressure on the party system itself, to put pressure on the media itself, basically allows anyone who has the intention to do something to use the platform of the media to undermine the media. And Donald Trump has shown how it's done. I don't think everyone can do what Donald Trump has done because he's really good at it, unfortunately. But he has absolutely shown how it can be done. And we certainly have seen a whole bunch of folks start into politics, sort of on his coattails and use similar strategies. Yeah. So my answer is to weirdify fascism, right? So the whole project of fascism is normalization, to normalize a certain way of seeing the world, of seeing, politics as warfare, seeing your opposition as an enemy, who counts as a good citizen and who counts as the enemy, right? Like all of that, even the strategies themselves are trying to be normalized, right? So normalizing and moving over to video is essentially what they are obsessed with. And the way that you combat that is you weirdify, right? So you do the opposite, you deconstruct, you expose all of the things that we do, in our scholarship, which is why academics are so threatened, right? There are bills, as you know, in this state and in Florida, they just passed one, and all over the United States that are trying to take away academic freedom, that are trying to suppress tenure, trying to control universities and what we teach. So that's because we're a threat. Any other questions?
Just curious, will the $1 million, there just seems like, there's a lot of people in politics, one of the whatever, but, just to get rid of it. I mean, Alex Jones, certain boxing personalities,
Yeah.
they care about this film, $5 million a year. Is that more focus on passing? But nowadays, it's more possibility.
Yeah. So one of my graduate professors was Bob McChesney, who wrote a book called Rich Media for Democracy. And that's absolutely true. Although the media is struggling, I think that whenever there's a financial incentive or a power incentive, either way, I think people think less of ethics as their motive, less of democracy as their motive, and more of the money and power. Yesterday I had someone from the Lincoln Project, probably a lot of you know what that is. He was a former Republican, now anti-Republican, speak to my political comm class on Zoom. And I asked him about ethics because the Lincoln Project doesn't put ethics first. And they think they have a reason why they're doing that. They think that, they're defending democracy. And so I'm on board with that. But I asked him, and he basically was like, that's a question. They don't think about that. They think about what's gonna move, what's gonna move people to retweet, what's gonna move Donald Trump to get mad at them and go crazy, things like that. They think about effect. If you've read Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, it's a lot like his discussion of means and ends. And I don't think he's alone. I almost feel naive, to ask about ethics.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Dr. Machia. Now, the reason I'm stopping her is not because of the time alone, but that we have a reception. So continue the conversation there. You said you have stickers. Stickers. So if you want stickers, you can see her there too. I'd like to make one announcement, which is something that you would like, which is the reception, the details. But there's another announcement which is equally important. I should have made in the very beginning. Dr. Endo Bhatka, right? Dr. Pascal. Would you please rise? Would you please rise? I want everybody to see you. Students, you need to remember that the travel grant that you received was actually started by him. He was the president of the SSSA. Please continue applying for it. And my important announcement is that in ballroom F at 5:45, there will be a presidential reception. We had some food in the restaurant yesterday or in the hotel yesterday for another reception. It was exceptionally good. So you may want to come. Thank you for paying rapt attention to the presentation and enjoying the reception. Thank you.